Uh, so the reason I shared this story is that it actually shows that even in what might well be apocryphal stories, hi, welcome, there may actually be information embedded that can be useful to historians. Right? Now, it may be that this is not an apocryphal story. It certainly sounds like the sort of thing that people make up and circulate about academics, but sometimes those stories that sound like too good to be true, too amusing to be true, may in fact be true. If we didn't have other sources of information for these details, we might realize that there was somebody named Derrida, and that he was recognizable by name because he's introduced without any kind of preface, would have realized that he was the sort of person you might expect to talk about chaos. And you might work out that he is not a native speaker of English, and there was some misunderstanding. And so these sorts of details are embedded in this story, whether it's an actual story or not. And in the same way, even in the infancy stories about Jesus, we have things like names of parents, which I think are much more likely to have actually been passed along and included rather than invented by the person who made, who told those stories. And so I think it is actually hopeful that we can find useful historical information, even in infancy traditions about John the Baptist, even if one is using modern historical approaches in which one needs to be skeptical, where the miraculous is inherently, by its very nature, improbable, is often set aside by the historian. So as I was working on this, one of the topics that I wanted to spend time looking at were infancy traditions about John the Baptist. And there was a book, I think it's the only book of its sort, and I'm not for that reason necessarily recommending it because it has a lot of shortcomings, but it nonetheless grabbed my interest in relation to this particular aspect of John the Baptist material. It's by Hugh Schonfield, who, if you recognize the name at all, will know had some interesting views on a variety of topics that were not by no means mainstream. But he published a book some years ago called The Lost Book of the Nativity of John, in which he took pieces from the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew, the Mandaean Book of John, and the Infancy Gospel of James, or Proto-Evangelium, and essentially put bits of it side by side to offer it as a sort of reconstructed ancient narrative by the John the Baptist movement about him. And the result is clearly inadequate, and yet it's intriguing, because it seems like it could actually work as a narrative, almost. And so wanted to examine the shortcomings of that and figure out what could we figure out about ancient John the Baptist infancy traditions, right? Because we have these sources, and yet they are very different in terms of their date, in terms of their relationship to the John the Baptist movement per se, and in other ways. And looking into this, I expected to largely say, yes, we can trace some contours, but we can't really get a sense of what the story was like in its earliest form. And now I'm actually more inclined to think that maybe we could, because there are these intriguing intersections, and even more of them than I expected to find. So I'm going to mention what our main sources are that I want to talk about this evening, at least briefly, and then dig first into the one known as the Proto-Evangelium, or Infancy Gospel of James. And that will seem like a strange one to start with, right? Because in a lot of ways, it has the least directly to do about John the Baptist. And it's later than, say, the Gospel of Luke, which also has infancy material about John the Baptist. But while starting with Luke, as arguably our earliest of these sources, might make sense, the status of the material in it about John the Baptist as having an earlier history coming from members of the Baptist movement and then being used by this Christian author is certainly something that is a widely entertained hypothesis, but it is a hypothesis and it's not universally accepted. And I think it's important at this point to mention that when I talk about this Christian author using Baptist material, one of the things that I find expressed in the literature is that they imagine Luke borrowing from the Baptist movement as though the Christian movement exists already as something distinct from this Baptist movement. And yet those who work on the history of early Christianity know that Christianity begins essentially within the context of John the Baptist's movement and becomes an offshoot of it. from it. And so just as it's important to not talk about Christianity in its early period over against Judaism, it's important not to talk about the Baptists as this group over there, right, rather than as part of the same shared heritage of the early Christians. Some, and I'm sure some present here, would say, well, just start with the Mandaean Book of John, right? Because that actually comes from a group that were clearly, and still today are clearly, followers of John the Baptist. And so its credentials as Baptist source material should be undisputed. But there's a long history of scholars of early Christianity setting this material aside as supposedly too late to be relevant. And I do have a chapter in the book that I have coming out in October arguing that these sources are not so late as to be irrelevant and we should be using them critically and cautiously, but using them. I will not be offering that argument in detail tonight, but you'll see one of the instances that persuades me that behind the Mandaean Book of John and the Gospel of Luke and other sources that we do have some earlier shared material that is not reflected, is not a result of, the commonalities are not a result of direct borrowing, say, of Mandaeans from the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of Luke straight from the Mandaean Book of John as we now know it. And so the Infancy Gospel of James, as strange as it might seem, this second century Christian work that is mostly about Mary's parents and then about Mary, nonetheless becomes the logical place to start because it is clearly from the second century, and it has what is at the very least a fragment of material that comes from the John the Baptist movement. And at the end of this work, there is a moment when Herod, the Magi have gone to Jerusalem, as per the story in Matthew. Herod is upset that the Magi have not returned with the whereabouts of the child, gives an order that children should be slain who are 2 years and under. And Joseph and Mary, in order to hide Jesus, place him in a manger, in a feeding trough. And so that in itself is a bit strange if you're familiar with the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. And then suddenly we're told, and Elizabeth knew that they were searching for John. And at that moment, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph drop out of the picture entirely. And the story focuses on not just Elizabeth and Zechariah, both of whom have been mentioned as sort of secondary or tertiary characters in this work, but John, who has not been mentioned before in the Infancy Gospel of James and is suddenly introduced there. And from that point on, we hear nothing more about Jesus or his family. And so scholars have been persuaded for a long time that this is, at the very least, a fragment of a work that comes from followers of John the Baptist. And one of the clearest pieces of evidence for that is the fact that when Herod is sending word to Zechariah to find out the whereabouts of his son, and Zechariah says, I'm a priest serving in the temple. I don't know where my son is. Herod becomes angry and says, his son is destined to rule Israel. And I think whether one is, from any perspective, that is just strange, right? Who were the people who thought that John is destined to rule Israel? One thing I think, though, we can safely say is it was not the Christians, right, who thought that somebody else was destined to rule Israel. And so between the focus on John, the lack of interest in Jesus as a character, and this messianic royal expectation about John the Baptist, you can see why this is thought to be, at the very least, a fragment of a Baptist work. And yet treating it as a fragment of a Baptist work, I found, was unsatisfactory, right? Because if you were, if we imagine the usually posited scenario that you have this infancy gospel about Mary and then about Jesus, and it ends with hiding Jesus in a manger, that is not an adequate ending, right? For those who know the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And so it's a puzzling ending for a Christian work. And then where it picks up the Baptist narrative is equally puzzling. And so I was looking for a way to make sense of this material as part of this project, and realized that the ending is so awkward, ending of the Jesus-focused material is so awkward, as well as the beginning of the John material, that there probably is a better explanation to be found. And as I was considering it, one is that this represents not a fragment of a Baptist work, but an instance of what scholars often call editorial fatigue. And for those who may not be familiar with it, I want to explain that that idea, right? So in the infancy gospel of James, we see this phenomenon of editorial fatigue quite often. And what this means is the author is using a source and yet changes the source in order to tell the story differently, but sometimes nonetheless includes details from that source the way they are in the original source material in ways that stand at odds with the changes that have been made, right? And so a famous example for those who study early Christianity is when Mark is telling the story about, or when Matthew is telling the story about Herod Antipas wanting to kill John. And that's how Matthew tells it. But he's using Mark and getting the story from Mark. And at one point then, when Mark says that Herod was saddened by the request that he behead John, Matthew includes that. Because in Mark, Herod was sympathetic to John, right? And it's all blamed on Herodias, right? And Matthew probably knew that that was quite implausible and that Herod Antipas actually wanted John dead. And so he starts telling the story that way. Yet he includes Antipas's sadness at the request, which doesn't make sense in Matthew. Why? Because he's using a source and unthinkingly includes that detail. And we get that in the infancy gospel of James as well. The star leads the Magi straight to Bethlehem, and yet Herod then has to send messengers because he hears that they've arrived, and yet pretty soon it sounds like they're talking directly as they do in Matthew. Mary is entrusted as a virgin, never to be married by Joseph, but into his care as this older widower in the gospel, this infancy gospel. And yet at one point when he discovers she's pregnant, he mentions considering the possibility of divorcing her, even though he has never married her and is not supposed to marry her. And so there too, we see source material being incorporated. And so what if in this puzzling ending, we have a clue that this author has been reworking Baptist material? Then we can go back to the beginning and we have this story with which the infancy gospel begins that is about two characters, Joachim and Anna, who are or Anne in the Christian tradition sometimes, who are, according to that story, the parents of Mary, this special child who is destined for greatness in all the ways that the Christian tradition goes on to explore. And it's been noted that these two characters resemble not just the parents of Samuel, right, but also Zechariah and Elizabeth. And so what if the Proto-Evangelium is in fact a reworked Baptist source that was originally about the parents of John the Baptist? Suddenly, things that are in the narrative make sense in an interesting way. And there are points at which it's possible to just put Zechariah in the place of Joachim, and it largely makes sense, right? So Zechariah Joachim is said to be a rich man, and he's going to offer his sacrifices on the great day of the Lord, and someone stands up to object and says it's not appropriate for you to offer your gifts first because you have begotten no offspring in Israel. And in the context of this work, so you don't get to offer your gifts first, right? It's not that big of a deal, right? Whereas if this were a story of a priest who serves in the temple, having objection to his playing the role that he's supposed to because he's never had children, he's clearly not, you've chosen him by lot for this service, but how can God have chosen him when he hasn't been blessed by God with a child? The story actually makes a lot of sense. When we then bring Luke into the picture, right, we see that some of this actually parallels very closely. And then when we bring the Mandaean Book of John into the picture, this was one of the places where I started realizing there are these interesting connections across the sources, where the puzzling characteristics of each of them can sometimes explain the other. And so chapter 18 of the Mandaean Book of John begins with, it says that a child was transplanted from on high. I'll come back to that phrase. And then a secret is revealed in Jerusalem. Priests have dreams. And then we're told suddenly, he opened his mouth for evil and his lying lips. And then there's this account of a vision in which a star appears over Elizabeth, a burning lamp over old Father Zechariah. And so we have a star over a woman who's destined to give birth, which of course also intersects with Christian storytelling, but not about John. But who opens his lips for evil in the temple? We're not told. And it's a puzzling thing that makes us think probably there was more to this story than has been included in this version of it. And suddenly we realize that that might be essentially a story fragment of the story that we also have in the Proto-Evangelium, where there is an objection to what Zechariah is doing, his service in the temple, because he does not have a child. And so that was one of the places where I realized that puzzling characteristics in two of these sources actually might connect with one another. Another point at which we have overlapping tradition, Luke leaves it really rather implicit that, yeah, I just realized I should probably have my phone out and be looking at the time every so often, so I'm not going over. We have, and should I still try to end at like 1:45, even though we started a bit late? Is that?
Please go.
Yeah. Okay, I will. Okay, we'll see. I don't want to try anyone's patience. Because I have no idea how much, particularly the people on Zoom, how, yeah, are they still wide awake and looking at the screen as far as you can tell? Okay, that's a good sign. Okay, those present are also doing so, I can carry on. Just trying to. Can't see enough of the, can't see part of the audience, and so it makes it harder to gauge. And so it's left implicit in the Gospel of Luke that John is dedicated as a lifelong Nazirite, in the way that Samuel and Samson were in the Jewish scriptures. In the Proto-Evangelium, though, it is made explicit, and we have a lot of the same elements that we get in the Samuel and or Samson story, right? An angel of the Lord appeared to Anna and said, "You shall conceive and bear," and we get the same phrasing in Luke. We get it also in Judges 13 and 1 Samuel 1. And some details intersect, such as the prohibition of wine and strong drink, and the growing of hair in different instances. And in the Proto-Evangelium, it's actually Mary who is dedicated to God in this way. And so it's interesting. And this could represent, right, if we ask why would Christians have taken a story about John the Baptist and his parents and turned it into a story about Mary and her parents? Well, by turning Mary into the one who essentially becomes the precursor for Jesus, you then draw attention away from the focus on John that was a bit of a challenge and a bit difficult for the Christian movement in its early days. And so we also have this intriguing feature that Mary's mother in the Infancy Gospel of James more than once almost breaks into the Magnificat, right? This famous poem from the Gospel of Luke about the birth of Jesus, at least in that context. And it's interesting that in more than one Old Latin manuscript of the Gospel of Luke, the Magnificat is actually explicitly attributed to Elizabeth, which would make a lot more sense, right? Because it is John the Baptist's birth that is patterned on the story of Samuel. And it's his parents who are more similar in that regard. They're an elderly couple who have been unable to have a child. And so it may be that in the Baptist source, that was in fact the case. And that has been proposed in relation to the Gospel of Luke, even without bringing these other sources into the picture. The Benedictus, right, in the Gospel of Luke, mentions raising up a mighty Savior in the house of his child David, which of course intersects with that interesting bit at the end of the Infancy Gospel, where Herod thinks that Zechariah's son is destined to rule over Israel. And there may be other evidence of underlying source material being incorporated in places, but the one that I want to focus on that I thought was perhaps most significant is one from the Mandaean Book of John, which I already mentioned, where it says, "A child is planted from on high." And this is an expression that is applied to John there. And I realized, although it's easy to miss because in the Gospel of Luke, we're dealing with a Greek source, and the Greek famously can be understood more than one way. But in Luke chapter 1, verse 78, there's this expression that is usually rendered as the day spring or the sunrise from on high, right? Anatole ex hupsos. And yet that word, Anatole, is used in the Septuagint, right, to render the word that you'll be familiar with, right, from the Hebrew Bible, tzemach, which is often translated in a messianic sense as the branch, right? The branch, the sprout, the shoot. There are a number of ways that you could render that into English, right? And if that's the meaning in this context, right, it has the Septuagintal meaning, as you know, and Luke's infancy stories in particular are full of Septuagintisms, then what the phrase means is the sprout from on high, right? The planting from on high. Essentially the same phrase, right? The same phrasing that's used in the Mandaean Book of John. And what I realized as I was looking into this is that the Syriac translation of the Gospels, which are the ones that would have been present to the Mandaean community in Mesopotamia, renders it with a Syriac word, dencha, that is actually more restricted to the astronomical and the light-related meaning of the word. And so you wouldn't get sprout from on high from the Syriac rendering of Luke. And so here in particular, I think that we have evidence that behind the Mandaean Book of John and the Gospel of Luke, we have some underlying tradition, right? And some phrasing that's reflected in both. And so you can see why I think that stories like, or material like this deserves more attention from New Testament scholars and scholars of early Christianity than it has been receiving of late. I can come back to any of these details that you like, but I will present them in sort of summary form, give you a bunch of them, and then we can dig into them in the question time if there's interest. There are other points of intersection that I think are interesting. Right? If we take the Gospel of Luke and the Infancy Gospel of James, again, there's this moment when we have this puzzling reference to Elizabeth secluding herself for 6 months, right? And if this is simply the child of Zechariah and Elizabeth, then there's really no reason, I mean, other than the fact that it's, you know, if you're an elderly woman and are pregnant, I mean, it could be a little disconcerting, but still, secluding yourself to the 6th month does not have an obvious meaning within that context. And we're told suddenly at one point in the Infancy Gospel of James that Joseph comes home and finds Mary pregnant in her 6th month, and then starts reacting, well, rather frantically, and is disturbed by what he's discovered. And so that congruence of the 6th month, right? Again, seeming like these could be parts of the same underlying tradition, which are puzzling in their current uses, but together as part of one story about the conception of John miraculously, right? And we have this very interesting reaction. Joseph reacts by beating himself. The Mandaean Book of John, I really love it at this point, when this has been revealed to Zechariah, that the meaning of this vision that a star appeared over Elizabeth and signs over Zechariah means that Elizabeth is going to have a child. He does what any person who gets this sort of news would do, and he smacks the high priest on the head. And the language is colorful, right? And so if you don't know Mandaean literature, I mean, it's so rich, it's full of humor, sometimes not very polite humor, even religious contexts. And he starts going on about, it's like, it's been, I can't remember, I'm trying to think how many years it's been since it's 22 years since I last saw my wife, I think is the phrase that he uses, right? And nevertheless, it's like, you know, it's like I didn't make Elizabeth pregnant, and there's this, you know, expression that sometimes rendered, you know, neither you nor I made Elizabeth pregnant, but makes reference to, you know, whether a cripple can grow legs. Maybe that is a euphemism for something other than legs at that point, but it's really rather bawdy, and but he's reacting in this way to the idea that Elizabeth is pregnant, and is pretty sure that he's not involved. And so while it's never explicitly said, right, that language of a child planted from on high is not usually understood in a sort of an incarnational way, right, in the way that Jesus comes to be viewed in Christianity. Nonetheless, we have this divine involvement, right, to the extent that, as also is possible in the Infancy Gospel of James, you have this question, so is this a miraculous conception, right? Is John essentially a virginal conception? And so one of the things that, you know, want to briefly mention is that if we bring in the yet another source that's related to the infancy gospel of James, the Armenian infancy gospel, there we have a high priest named Eleazar, so the same as in the Mandaean Book of John, and we have a recognition that the story that he's starting to tell about Zechariah, he's like, so yeah, you all realize that this is basically the story I've just been telling about Joachim earlier in this book, right? And so it's as though the person who's doing this version of it recognizes that there is this overlap there, right? Mention the star, mention the seemingly miraculous conception. That's not all when it comes to the intersections. And so I want to mention one more major one that also deserves to be considered. Mentioned this oddity that Herod is seeking for John in that ending of the infancy gospel of James. When and where did that come about? Right? And in the version that we have, we're not told. But we do have other material about child and mother being, or at least one or the other, being whisked away to safety. And so in the Mandaean Book of John, the Jews, right, seek to kill John. And so he's whisked away to safety. In the Christian tradition, right, we also have in the book of Revelation, right, the mother who is taken to the wilderness, gives birth to a child who's destined to rule, who is taken to safety. And in the infancy gospel of James, Elizabeth flees with John to the wilderness, right, and a mountain welcomes her. And so these traditions about fleeing with the child to safety seem also to have been part of Baptist storytelling that has deep roots behind some of our Christian sources, as well as the Mandaean Book of John. And so coming back to it, still not satisfied with what Schoenfield did in his book, just simply taking these things and sticking them together into one long narrative. And yet there are so many points of intersection that I think we do have hints of, at the very least, the outline of what an infancy story about John the Baptist looked like, that goes back before Luke and before the infancy gospel of James and before the Mandaean Book of John, right, to some shared, whether oral storytelling or written source material or both, right? Signs, importance, right, of the birth, slander or opposition to the father, angelic announcement, John's parents being Zechariah and Elizabeth, Zechariah as a priest, the child being a Nazarite, and I think there's a lot more significance to that as well, which I will not go into. Discussion of illustrious ancestry, authority seeking to kill the child, mother and child flee to the wilderness, and of course, in the wilderness is, of course, where then John appears in his adult activity in a number of Gospels. And so what I'd like to do at this point is just draw, I think, this part of things to a close and open it to question. But you can see why I got excited by this. It seems like we can actually get a sense of this. And I feel, in some ways, I felt rather remiss that I had really neglected John the Baptist as an aspect of what I was interested in when I did my doctoral work on the Gospel of John, back when I met John and Elizabeth and Durham in England, and we were there at the same time. It seems that this question of the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus drove early Christological development, drove narrative development in the telling of infancy stories about John the Baptist and about Jesus, so that, you know, we get this kind of thing where it's like, yeah, had a vision of a star over the mother. Okay, well, we're going to have a real star, right? But you have also these elements, perhaps, of the earlier tradition that create puzzling things. Like, why does the star lead Magi to Jerusalem if the child is born in Bethlehem, right? And the possibility that this is originally a motif that was connected with John and his father who serves in Jerusalem, or that it led them straight to Bethlehem and it was part of a somewhat different story than Matthew tells. All of these are possibilities. And so what I realized as I was spending a year working on this, and this became a chapter in my book, I realized that any of these chapters in this book of mine could be a book of its own. right? And you could have a whole series like we have for the historical Jesus, right? You have A Marginal Jew, right, by John Meyer, and you could have a volume on the infancy stories, and you could have a volume. And then what I realized, sadly, is that at the moment, nobody would want that, except me and a handful of other people, many of whom are here, right? But that's not enough to persuade a publisher that you should publish a whole series of books about John. But what I hope is that by revisiting the question of the relevance of Mandaean sources, by working on the question of infancy material and suggesting that we might be able to reconstruct more of the outline of that than we have done up until now, by looking at the question of John as a Nazarite and as the son of a priest and what the implications of that might have been, and on, the relationship of John and Jesus, that hopefully we will have a new era in paying attention to John and not rushing past him, particularly if we are interested in early Christian history, in our rush to get to Jesus. And that in doing so, for those who are more interested in Jesus than in John, I think that even so, if that's your interest, taking the time to pay close attention to John is crucial to getting Jesus right as well. So let me just quickly see if I can jump to a slide. Sorry. I will just, the down button. I want to make sure that I pull up something that, because I have some physical flyers here. So I persuaded the publisher of my current biography of John the Baptist and the book that's coming out in October to make a discount code because they didn't have the book printed in Australia yet. It will be available here, but they realized it was not going to happen in time for my visit and for the conference that's happening next week in Melbourne. And so they were willing to make a discount code available and wanted to make sure that those who are online don't miss out on that just because they're not present, because I can't really give them a flyer and do things like that. So, but thank you for paying attention to this. I hope that I'm right, that this stuff is really interesting for people who have the kinds of interests that those present here today have. Thank you.
So, does anybody have any questions for James?
Or strong objections are welcome too. So yeah.
Anybody online?
Yeah. Let's see. I might be able to see the chat on here too, which would be good. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think I can see that. Let's see. So we have a question. Is some of this midrash? Is it not the case that midrash does allude closely to another passage, but very intentionally different to give a different message? So I think there's some, Christians sometimes use midrash in a way that nobody in the Jewish tradition uses midrash, as though what it actually involved was taking elements, taking earlier stories and using it to come up with, completely new stories, just as a kind of a way of creating new literature. And I think what we're dealing with here is literature that is decidedly trying to say things, right? Just as if we have Davidic imagery connected with Jesus, right? It's not as though they're just taking stories about David and deciding to weave new narratives. They're trying to say Jesus is this figure who brings the Davidic line back and who does this messianic thing, right? And so in the same way, I think it's safe to say that there was a tradition that John is something like a new Samuel. Right? And one of the things I think is astonishing, and for anyone who happens to be, let's say a grad student looking for a PhD topic, surprisingly little has been written about John as a new Samuel. Right? Because again, we're interested in Jesus as, is Jesus Elijah? Is John, John is not Elijah, right, is of interest to Christian scholars working on these texts, but John as Elijah is less so, right? And so I think that the aim here, right, there certainly may be some useful points of comparison with Jewish storytelling, where you have elements of other stories woven in, and we certainly do see some of that happening in the John the Baptist stories. But I think the point is to say John is a figure like this. John is a figure of this sort of significance. John is a figure with attributes, right? And in some cases, historical figures may have started that, right? There's in the Christian tradition, I know it's controversial because of what he was wearing. It's not Mandaean priestly garb dressed in white, but it is wearing camel hair, which I would like to emphasize does not mean camel skins, right? You often see John depicted in Christian influenced movies as though he were a caveman and things like that. And I think that's badly wrong. But there's a long tradition of suggesting that he might have been cosplaying essentially the prophet Elijah. And in doing so is saying, yeah, is saying something about Herod Antipas and Herodias, probably, but also about his own significance and how he understands himself.
Bernard has a question? Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay, the one now sold on John the Baptist, of course, very good. We already have your first book in the library, thanks to Paul, by the way. I'm not quite sure about this, but the sources of the Proto-Evangelium go back to already Syriac, aren't they?
Yeah, quite possible. And there's some puzzling things in there that I would like to go, look at and see whether, as part of this sort of investigation, whether misunderstandings of the Syriac as it got rendered into Greek could actually help us explain some of these things. But yeah, quite possibly.
So I was wondering if,
yeah.
So the earlier traditions of John the Baptist, are they largely in Syriac?
Well, we have some very important ones neglected by New Testament scholars in a dialect of Aramaic, not Syriac, but another one. Mandaic is also a dialect of Aramaic. But there is significant Syriac material about John. One of the things I found fascinating is that there are prayers attributed to John the Baptist in the Syriac tradition, and there are multiple versions of a prayer of something that's called a prayer that John taught his disciples, and one version of it starts with Father, so in Syriac Abba, right? And the other one starts with Holy Father. And so these phrases that we get in the prayers of Jesus in the Gospel, including in John 17, right, the phrase Holy Father. And so it's fascinating to me that the Syriac tradition kept alive this sort of memory that the way John the Baptist prayed was how Jesus prayed, right? Which is sort of implicit in the Lucan introduction to the Lord's Prayer. Teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples to pray. But there was no obligation of the Syriac tradition to make that part of how they envisaged John teaching his disciples to pray in the way that they did. And so there's so much there in this material that really hasn't been studied, I think, to the extent that it deserves to be. Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating lecture. I have several questions, but probably it seems that is just to go technically about the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist. So one of the interesting parts of this is the baptismal activities of John the Baptist and also the followers of Jesus Baptist activities, as well as the original what's the origin of these baptismal activities,
right?
And you know that, and many know that, in for example, in Jewish sources, that John the Baptist is the one who is very interesting, very famous, very. I mean, got the focus there, and it was really later than Jesus grabbed the attention. The other part is the how much the followers of John the Baptist have some kind of influence on the followers of Jesus and so on. So I mean, there are several other questions, but I will stop there.
We can start with those, and you know how to reach me if I don't get to your other questions, because I would like to at least hear them and have a chance to answer them. So one of the things that I thought was going to probably make Mandaeans and Christians equally unhappy as I worked on this project was the fact that I wasn't going to be saying either, Jesus went completely off the rails as per the Mandaean tradition and completely let John down by doing these other things. I'm not sure. I think that Christianity certainly went far from John's sort of teaching. But yeah, so there, on the one hand, differing from the Mandaean, portrait in my historical reconstruction. On the other hand, not saying that John was doing what, particularly the Gospel of John says, yeah, don't pay attention to me, pay attention to doing all of that, which sounds much more like the Christian tradition as it's developing, saying, yeah, don't, Jesus, look, yeah. And so I think that at least some of that, and maybe much of it, reflects a time after John had died, after Jesus had died, when you have this movement that is placing increasing focus on Jesus as, believing he is the fulfillment of John's work and John's aims, and many of John's followers not being persuaded by that claim, right? And so just as we say that in the Gospel of John, for instance, right, and that was what sort of connected me with the work on the Mandaeans to begin with, we suggest that ongoing conflict between a Jewish Christian community and leaders of a synagogue are reflected in how the story about Jesus is told in ways that are anachronistic and don't reflect exactly what was going on. We don't have followers of Jesus being cast out of the synagogue in the era of the historical Jesus in the way that we do perhaps later on, right? And that's read back into the story as it's told. And so I think we get some of that in the storytelling about John and Jesus, so that Matthew has John say, you come to me, I need to be baptized by you. And on the other hand, we have the Mandaean version saying, yeah, I don't want to baptize this guy. He's going to be bad news, right? And eventually a message comes from heaven, not saying, this is my beloved son, but, baptize the deceiver. It's going to be okay, John. You're not going to be blamed for this, basically. What he does is going to be on him, right? And so we have these two things that are clearly in dialogue with one another, right? And that was something as well that I wrestled with in this project, is that, the infancy gospel of James, why not, it seems to know Matthew, it seems to know Luke. Why not just say that all of this is from there? But clearly that ending is not from either of those. And we should not treat this as an either or to the extent that we sometimes do, right? The fact that the Gospel of Matthew, right, its author knew the Gospel of Mark, doesn't mean that Matthew heard the stories for the first time reading Mark's Gospel, right? And so some places where Matthew changes Mark, it may be Matthew reverting it to the form in which Matthew had always heard it, right? And so we might have an earlier version despite it being a later writing, right? And I think that the Mandaean Book of John, in its telling of the baptism of Jesus story, it sounds like it knows the Gospels and is poking fun at some of the elements in the story. And yet it may still nonetheless have independent tradition as well, right? I don't think it's an either or. I think it can be a both and. But clearly, baptism, as something that is taken for granted in Christianity, would not be part of Christianity were it not for John's influence on Jesus, right? That becomes part of it. And yet, precisely because Jesus and union with Jesus and his death and resurrection and things like that become the focus of Christian baptism becomes something very different. It becomes something that's done once for all, whereas Mandaean baptism, and I'd argue John's baptism, were things that could be repeated, right? Just like sacrifice could be repeated, right? On major festivals, right? As just something you do every year, but also when you need forgiveness, right? And that might be why in the history of Christianity, suddenly we have these debates that, it seems like somebody would have thought about this sooner. What do we do about post-baptismal sin, right? Can there be forgiveness for this? Like, well, surely, when you were inventing this, didn't you think, well, if it was something repeatable in principle, then that would not be an issue, right? When you turn it into something as a one-time identification with Jesus and his death and resurrection, other issues emerge, right, and arise. So I think, another part of this, let me put it this way, another part of this project was to try to take the Mandaean and Christian baptismal practices and to triangulate back and say, at the very least, the things that are shared in common and that pop up in the Christian tradition as well, probably go back to John, right? Because we have John's influence in these streams, even if indirectly. And then to ask where there are differences, which are more likely. And certainly sometimes I come down on the answer, the Mandaeans probably have preserved it. Yeah.
Consult my article on Christian and Mandaean perspectives on baptism.
Yeah.
Done,
Yeah.
24 years ago.
I'm trying to remember if that one is actually in my footnotes somewhere. It should, yeah, some things that you've written are definitely in there, but I'm trying to remember, yeah.
Okay,
if
so we
it's-
have a
they're all
question
in
from
there.
John.
Thanks very much, Jane. A really typically interesting, creative, and persuasive presentation, skirting over lots of things. Rather than driving back to John's Gospel, which is where you got the energy from, I've gone back to Luke. Maybe actually in what Zechariah says in chapter 1 of Luke, maybe Christians have been too quick to jump. You, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways.
Mhm,
And we Christians think, oh, go before the Lord. He's talking about Jesus already.
mhm.
But what happens if Zechariah
Right.
is
Right.
talking about the Lord,
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
and the knowledge
Yeah.
of salvation that's coming by the forgiveness of their sins is what John is going to bring.
Yeah.
And so Luke has actually
Yeah,
set out here. This is what the thought was about John. Then, of course, when his figure of John gets going, that figure of John does what Matthew and Mark and John have done, which is to
Yeah.
say, oh, John, it's not about me,
Right.
it's about him. What the
Mhm.
20 figure one. So yeah, they all slide away from it,
Yeah.
but actually the possibility is there in Luke 1.
yeah. And the
Zechariah
question,
really
right,
thought this about his son.
yeah.
so to speak.
And or that, that the source material was, in its original context, was about, that was just about John, right? It was not about John and Jesus, or John as precursor to Jesus, but about John. Yeah, indeed. I think Lynn is fielding I'm not
One
sure.
last
So-
question, I think. Here we go.
Only one last question. I think I can draw your attention to some biographies of John the Baptist in an early number of Patrologia Orientalis. See how that works. They will pay attention because it shows that early Christians were very interested in
Mhm.
John's biography as such. After all, John becomes a saint
Mhm.
in the Christian church. Saint John the Baptist.
Yeah.
And it's the opposite in the case of Landon towards
Sure.
Jesus. I know one of the things that I was thinking may relate to this is in Josephus, John tells us that Josephus tells us that John is not using baptism as a way of initiation.
Mhm.
John is using it as a way of sanctification of a long process of engaging with Judaism. That would be the same with Josephus. When he goes into the desert, goes after going through the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes to work on himself with plants, a kind of equivalent to John the Baptist
Mhm.
in the desert, according to his autobiography.
Mhm.
So John is not using baptism in a way that is remotely related to the way we as Christians might think
Mhm.
it would be. As an initiative. However, in the East, there's a picking up because of adult baptism lasting very long in the Middle East, that you have some ascetic movements that will not actually involve themselves. They'll choose to be ascetics very young, but not be baptized until they're ready to be ascetics. Such as with the sons of the covenant in the Antioch tradition. And they're different from ordinary baptisms. And they preserve this connection with the Baptist in the way that Josephus seems to indicate.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. So just to touch on very quickly on a couple of things you mentioned. So the Christian tradition included, Jesus saying John is essentially the greatest person that ever lived, right? Among those born of women, there's none greater than John. And that pretty much excludes the possibility that you can really denigrate this figure, right? You can try say, well, Jesus must increase and I must decrease, but you can't say this figure is It didn't stop the the author of the pseudo-Clementine literature from viewing John as in a negative way, but it stopped most of the Christian tradition from doing so. I think that's one reason why we don't see something that's sort of the exact opposite of, or the exact equivalent of what we see in Mandaism with regard to Jesus, right? Yeah.
That he was least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Remember?
Yeah.
That
Sure.
thing goes on.
It does.
There's an ambiguity there.
So the thing is,
Should not affect
well,
the general situation.
so I don't, because, those born of, those who enter the kingdom includes those born of women, right? That's like, those are overlapping categories. I don't think that can actually be treated as a way of saying, I'm giving John this absolutely, a superlative compliment, and I'm going to immediately revoke it, right? I think that has to mean either in the, when the kingdom of God dawns, the least in the kingdom will be greater than John, the greatest who ever lived, is now, right? So the greatest now doesn't compare to the least then, right? The kingdom is going to be so amazing. Or one alternative is that it's saying, like you might say, Moses was the greatest prophet who ever lived, and yet the least who entered the promised land was greater than him, right? So that, John, by not living to see the kingdom fully dawn, misses out on this thing that others would get. There's also a possibility. But I don't think yeah, I mean, I've had some suggest that, Jesus might even have been excluding John from the kingdom, right? And so that those who enter the kingdom, the least of them is greater than John. And that doesn't seem plausible, given that, I mean, Matthew has John proclaiming the kingdom before Jesus is, right? Summarizing the message in the same way.
There are markers in the New Testament between John and the coming of the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
In that some special sense. There are markers.
Yeah, and I have more thoughts about Banus and Josephus's one-time teacher and John and other things, but I gather we don't have time for talking about everything that we might consider. What I will say is that some of this is in my book. So I will say, so I have, okay. Yeah, so I brought a few copies, but there's only so much you can fit in your luggage and take to Australia with you. And so I would have ended up disappointing people anyway. And so instead I have flyers with a discount code. You can get 40% off, which I would not have been able to beat if I brought copies for sale or something like that. And so one of the books is currently out elsewhere and should be here very, very soon. And I knew Mandaeans are not going to like this title. We'll happily say more about why I chose it nonetheless. Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist. It's a biography of John the Baptist. And then the book that's coming out in October is not just an expanded edition of this. It's a series of studies. So can we use Mandaean sources? And if so, how? The origins of baptism, right? And where did John get the inspiration for this? And what did it mean when John was doing it? The infancy traditions, the relationship between Jesus and John, prayers of John the Baptist, and a variety of other things. And so it's a collection of studies that dig into a lot more detail than most people want to go into. But clearly, we are the exception, right? Who actually want that kind of detail and think that John deserves that sort of attention. And so should I just pass some of these around? Seems like a good thing to do. And those who are online have that there. And so, yeah.
So what I'm saying is, let's thanks James, and if you have some more questions, we'll still be here, so you can ask James your questions. But if you have to go, then you can head off. So thank you very much, James. It's wonderful.
Thank you.